Truth Caviar, the show about ideas that matter. Hosted by global thinkers Brent M. Eastwood and Vadim Bichutsky. Welcome in to Truth Caviar, the show about ideas that matter. Hope y'all having a great week. I am Vadim Bichutsky, and I'm here with my co-host, Brent M. Eastwood. This is episode 6, and today we're talking all about energy, fossil fuels, renewables, and green. So let's start off with some facts. Fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy around the world. Fossil fuels use is growing, particularly in developing countries like China, Russia, and India. Fossil fuels provide 4 times more energy than all alternatives combined. Fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. Fossil fuels are low cost, reliable, and can be produced on demand in large quantities, incredibly versatile, can be used to power a great many machines. On the scale of billions of people and in thousands of places, and is essential to human flourishing. Cost-effective energy is essential. Billions of people are dying and suffering for lack of cost-effective energy. Renewables such as solar and wind account for just 3% of the world's energy, despite their many mandates, investments, and subsidies. And that 3% is almost exclusively for electricity, which is less than 1/5 of the world's energy use. Solar and wind make almost no contribution to many crucial areas of energy that are dominated by fossil fuels, such as heavy-duty transportation and many forms of industrial process heat, which generate very high levels of heat for such processes as making plastic and cement. Further, solar and wind are intermittent, uncontrollable sources of energy. That 3% is totally dependent on reliable, controllable power plants, which are powered by fossil fuels. Thus, solar panels, wind turbines, and long-distance power lines don't replace the costs of controllable electricity infrastructure. They add to them. This is why the more solar and wind grids use, the more their electricity tends to cost. And paradoxically, solar and wind rely on fossil-fueled power plants. The use of solar and wind has caused reliability problems everywhere they have been used in non-trivial quantities. The world has continued to be a better place to live, especially for the poorest people on the planet, because of low-cost, reliable energy provided by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have powered machines and enabled industrialization that has dramatically reduced global poverty, defined as those who live on less than $2 a day, from 42% in 1980 to less than 10% today. Climate-related deaths continue to fall to all-time lows thanks to fossil-fueled machines. Fossil-fueled irrigation, heating systems, air conditioning, cooling systems, construction of sturdy buildings, and early warning systems. All of these are powered by fossil fuels. Over the last century, the rate of climate-related disaster deaths have fallen by 98%. Climate emergency or climate crisis are no longer treated as predictions about the future. They are treated as being in the present, even though today we're safer from climate than humans have ever been before. Net zero or carbon neutral would be apocalyptic for the human race. Such policy prescriptions would kill more people than 100 million people who have died throughout history at the hands of communist regimes. If we join a movement to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, and it turns out that intermittent solar and wind cannot replace fossil fuels, both for the billions of people who have affordable, reliable energy and billions who need it, we will absolutely have blood on our hands. China, which has an explicit goal of being the world's leading superpower by 2049, is using 85% fossil-fueled economy to get there, including using fossil fuels to produce unreliable solar panels and wind turbines that contribute to rising energy costs and lower reliability of American electrical grid. The unprecedented security that Americans and the rest of the free world enjoy today is due to America's economic strength and military might. Both our economy and military depend on low-cost, reliable energy from fossil fuels. A world in which America is destroying its economy and military while China leverages low-cost, reliable fossil fuels to become the largest economy and the most formidable military in the world is not the world I want to live in. We need more fossil fuels, not less.
We're looking at everything in energy wrong. So instead of negative impacts of fossil fuels, we should look at how much humanity is flourishing with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels provide fuel to ultra cost-effective machines. We're going to be talking about all the different types of machines that need fossil fuels to make life a better place and the world a better place. And they save on labor and time. They nourish billions of people for abundant food and clean water. We get a safer world provided by fossil fuels. And fossil fuels also offer ultra cost-effective machine labor. This radically increases human productivity in a dangerous world. It gives humans time to develop technology, think of innovations, and improve lives. So we should advance human flourishing instead of all these scare tactics. Evaluate fossil fuels on their positive impacts, like lifting people out of poverty, economic development and job creation, better industrial growth, life expectancy has gone up over the years because of fossil fuels. GDP per capita has gone up. World population has grown. So you have better productivity, you have better technology, you have better ideas. And the livability of the world has not been negatively impacted by fossil fuels to create this existential crisis that everybody talks about.
This climate emergency.
Yes. So solar and wind, as you said, provide only 3% of the world's energy, mainly for electricity now. But there's also vehicle mobility we have to worry about. We have to worry about industrial heating to create plastics and cement and steel. Wind and solar cannot get us to the point where we use industrial heating for renewables. And my question is, how will trucks and ships run on wind and solar or batteries? We don't have the technology with batteries right now. I invested in a tech startup that focused on using batteries in electric vehicles for the transport of semi-trucks and semis on batteries. And I lost money on that investment because it's just not viable. It's not economically viable to power semis by electricity right now. Now that could change, but what about ships? You could do nuclear for ships, which the Navy does, US Navy does, in submarines. But how are you going to power shipping? I'm talking about cargo shipping with wind and solar. Are you going to use batteries for diesel engines? I don't think so. I don't think that's economically viable, even if you knew how to do it.
But the left opposes nuclear.
And you're right. We're going to talk about that. I mean, nuclear energy is some of the cleanest energy you can get. Some people think nuclear energy is the cleanest energy you can have.
Absolutely. It has no CO2 emissions, but they still oppose it. The left is anti-human. They're not so much pro-planet, they're anti-human. They believe that our impact on the planet is disastrous and the planet would be better off with less or even no humans at all.
Even if billions of people lack electricity, how are we going to get that power? There's examples of towns in India that have tried to do full 100% renewables. And people came to the mayor and said, can we have real energy? They called it real energy. So then their grid got hooked back up to coal-fired plants and they resumed activity as usual.
And the way that you can tell that the left is anti-human is because they oppose natural gas, they oppose nuclear, they oppose hydroelectric, and they even oppose fracking, a process of extracting oil and gas from shale rock that has revolutionized U.S. energy production. It could be used far more to extract oil and gas around the world.
There's all kinds of shale gas and oil deposits where fracking could extract tons of oil and tons of natural gas out of European countries, but they refuse to even look at that.
I actually heard somebody on the podcast say that we're actually lucky that we have the level of fracking that we do, because apparently Obama didn't really know that it existed. Had he known, he would have regulated it to death. So the fact that the amount of fracking that we have that has revolutionized our energy sourcing, we would even have less had Obama been more active and more aware of its technologies.
I wish the elites in Washington, D.C. could travel to Midland, Odessa, Texas, and Hobbs, New Mexico, and check out the Permian Basin.
You know those states very well.
I do. I lived in both states. And, it was the energy industry that built up those states. And also North Dakota with the Bakken Shale. So
the North Dakota explosion, right? The energy explosion in North Dakota that has generated all these high-paying jobs.
Unbelievable. You can start out in the oil and gas industry and you can make $85,000 a year without a college degree.
Amazing.
So if we could get more elites from the East Coast, from these capitals that propagate all of these types of regulations and rules on fracking and other types of fossil fuels, you would have a better understanding of what the stakes are that we're talking about today.
And the left's war on fossil fuels is why we have these extraordinarily high gas prices, right? I mean, imagine if we lived in Oklahoma or something like that, where we have to drive 60 miles to get groceries, right? We're lucky. We live in an urban area. We walk everywhere.
Yeah. And the United States is the number one oil producer in the world. And we used to be a net positive. So we had a net positive in 2019 and 2020, where we were exporting more oil than we imported. And then we had the Biden administration come in, and that has really changed.
Keystone Pipeline. He canceled the Keystone Pipeline.
That's the first thing he did.
I mean, that's amazing. Like, you think about it, we're basically destroying our country. I mean, energy produces, you need energy for everything, making coffee, computers, water, electricity. Energy is a product that underlies every other product. And so if you're going to kill energy, you're basically destroying your economy.
Why can't the United States produce more oil and natural gas to get prices down due to supply and demand problems in a tight market? Well, there are two things that affected the oil and gas industry in the last couple of years. One is that their stocks and the companies have decided, instead of drilling and producing more fracked wells, because when you frack, the wells don't last a long time. So you have to constantly re-drill and re-drill. That's one of the problems with fracking. But oil companies are not doing that because they have been forced to do share buybacks and increase their dividend for investors and their stocks. And then the second problem is you had this ESG trend.
Yeah, right.
Where it's, you can't get a good enough.
You can invest in fossil fuels.
You can invest in fossil fuels from banks. Banks are saying they're not going to invest in fossil fuels because oil and gas is the next tobacco that we should avoid. And this is what the left said.
And just to be totally clear, I'm not against renewables. I'm not against solar and wind. I'm for investments in those technologies to make sure that we can hopefully someday transition to them. But it has to be a smart transition. You can't just turn off your economy tomorrow and say, hey, let's use wind and solar. It's just like introducing a new product. If you're a startup, you have to test it, roll it out slowly, to make sure it works, and, test it thoroughly. Like I said, you can't just completely switch your economy to a brand new technology, that has never existed before.
Sure. And going back to Texas about all of the above energy sources, I think solar and wind to a certain extent are great, because if you go to Texas, you can also see how Texas is number one in wind and number two in solar. And you can see in West Texas where the wind blows really hard in the spring and the fall, you can see these wind farms, and it's really amazing to see. Now, there's environmental impacts of wind farms. They kill birds, and they're not, some people think they're ugly. I think they're really cool to see.
But Texas just had an energy crisis in the winter.
They did, because a lot of the times in ultra cold weather, the wind doesn't blow as much. And the other problem that Texas has with their wind energy is that when there is heat and oppressive heat and humidity, the wind doesn't blow as much. So in the summertime in Texas, with the wind not blowing, most people, it's 105 degree heat, they're running their air conditioner all the time. And then so Texas, ERCOT, which regulates the energy industry in Texas, tells people to turn their air conditioners down,
it puts too much stress on the system.
And because it's putting too much stress on the system. And the solar is great in New Mexico, where I live too, because in the southern part of New Mexico, you're getting all kinds of sunshine. In New Mexico, you can have over 300 days of sunshine a year, but a very small state, there's only 2 million people and they're spread out. And so there's like 3 cities in New Mexico where solar would make sense to power a lot of people, but a lot of people live in rural areas in New Mexico. So that's one of the difficulties with solar and wind, is that you have to have some type of transportation to get the power to the populace. And then we have reliability concerns about renewable energy. Wind does not blow all the time. Sun does not shine all the time. There's not adequate storage infrastructure or batteries right now. And it creates the need for more transmission infrastructure.
Stick your renewables where the sun don't shine.
And then going back to climate future and this existential problem that we're all going to die someday because of climate change. Well, let's talk about the historical modes of fear peddling that people have used. So we had in the 1970s the fear of global cooling. So we had that all through the 70s. And then there were the people who worried about existentially running out of fossil fuels and natural resources, and that we would have wars over resources.
Resource depletion,
that we were running out of oil
existential
and gas.
crisis.
Yeah, peak oil, we're going to run out. And then remember earthquakes? When's the last time you saw an article or a TV presentation about earthquakes in the United States? San Andreas Fault.
Probably like 94 LA.
The New Madrid Fault. Earthquakes were going to destroy the United States.
Well, there's one. Wasn't there one that caused a tsunami? Where was that?
That was in Japan.
Was it Japan? Okay, yeah.
And right. I think Indonesia too.
Indonesia or something.
No, that was pretty bad. But you're not seeing the high incidence of these types of natural disasters. So earthquakes are going to destroy the United States. All our oceans are going to die. People will have to wear gas masks because of pollution.
Oh, yeah. I read that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And then there was also Y2K in the 90s. So people thought that Y2K was going to come and reset all the computers and that you needed to prepare for doomsday. That was going to be this doomsday Y2K thing. I remember going to Washington, D.C. I lived in West Virginia at the time on when the New Year's Eve when 2000 flipped over and everybody's like, oh my gosh, there's going to be riots in the streets in DC. Nothing happened. Y2K came and nothing happened.
In the 60s and 70s, Paul Ehrlich predicted that resource depletion, including fossil fuel depletion, plus an increasing population would lead to a population bomb and mass starvation unless dramatic government measures were taken.
Sure.
Put your food resources in the hands of the government. Isn't that lovely?
Talk about Bill Gates, what he says.
In 2010, Bill Gates gave a TED Talk on the climate crisis. And he laid out the IPAT framework, which basically says that the amount of CO2 that's emitted has several factors. The number of people in the world, the number of services that are used per person, the number of energy that are used per service, and CO2 that's emitted per unit of energy. So there's like 4 factors there. The big one there is people. So he claimed in the 2010 TED Talk that if we do a great job with vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health, aka abortion, then we can reduce the population by about 15 to 20%. So it just shows you that this climate change agenda is related to the COVID/vaccine agenda and also to the population control agenda.
And let's talk about United States again. So there's the people that believe that leave all the resources in the ground, don't extract anything, and have a rapid transition to renewables. Sounds great. And it's a great way to talk about getting elected and moving your political message forward with a Green New Deal. Look at some of the American states where renewables are not possible. Alaska. It's dark half the year in Alaska. There's not enough roads in Alaska to transport the wind turbines. Remember, you have to transport these huge turbines on humongous trucks with long trailers. It works in Texas because there's a network of highways and interstates in Texas where you can transport it and other states. Not so in Alaska. You don't have a network of roads and highways. Juneau, Alaska, the capital, you can't drive there. You have to fly in there. So it is not economically or technically possible to do a wind turbine in Alaska.
I've never been to Alaska.
Yeah, I've been there once. And
did you enjoy it?
I did. But you had to use ships.
Did you see Russia from your hotel?
But again, no roads in Alaska and then the sun doesn't shine. So you have that problem. How about North Dakota and South Dakota? Well, not enough sunlight for solar. Iowa is great in wind, but not good in solar. Minnesota, not good in solar. The sun doesn't shine enough. I lived in West Virginia and there's not enough sunlight. Not windy enough in West Virginia.
But also there's no sun at night.
Well, that's the intermittent problem that you have to do.
Exactly.
Going back to West Virginia, the soil is too rocky to install wind turbines. So you got to worry about the solar. or you got to worry about the soil.
Yeah, and those wind turbines, they actually kill wildlife, right? They kill birds.
They kill birds.
Yeah, they're highly destructive to the environment, paradoxically. And so one thing that I really want to emphasize here is that the left, they're not pro-human, they are anti-human because they believe that our presence on the planet is disastrous.
That we negatively impact everything. Instead of talking about the other opposite way, the alternative way is that humans have flourished and have been enriched by fossil fuels over the years, instead of being an existential threat.
But also, it could be argued that the humans have actually made the planet better.
Oh,
because the planet is not some perfect entity. It's very dynamic. It's very volatile. There's a lot of predators, all kinds of stuff. Even if humans never existed, you have all kinds of things going on the planet. The planet isn't in some perfect equilibrium in the way that the left describes. Humans have actually contributed more positive than negative to the planet.
And I'm not a climate change denier. I even have a chapter in my new book that's on future warfare about climate change and the military. So I looked at Australian wildfires and I looked at the potential for sea level rising in the United Kingdom. And in both of those countries, you would need military presence if that scenario happened. It's a plausible scenario. So I don't think it is the scenario. I think climate change is a scenario that could happen that is plausible. Now, people would probably call me a denier because I said that, but at least I don't deny the whole thing. I think it's a plausible future that we do have to plan for.
Even if you accept that the temperatures have risen, let's say by 1 degree centigrade in the last 170 years, since the Industrial Revolution. Even if you accept that premise, there are two fundamental questions that flow from that. A, is it disastrous? And is it good or is it bad? So the left, they're anti-human. Their framework is anti-human. They're like, any change to the planet that are caused by humans are bad. But just like everything in life, a change could be good or a change can be bad. If I upgrade to first class from coach, the good is I'm more comfortable. The bad news, it costs more. So every change has pluses and minuses. The fact that it's gotten warmer, even if you accept the premise that humans have caused 1 degree centigrade increase in temperatures, we can argue whether that's good or bad. Being warmer isn't necessarily bad. People are still dying from cold. More people are dying from cold than from heat. Also, more CO2 emissions, that leads to more plants being grown because they use CO2. So that's a positive. When we think about climate change, we have to think about, climate change is regardless of humans. We had glaciers millions of years ago. And so if you have a pro-human framework in your mind instead of an anti-human framework, then we would take these questions into account and we would say maybe human influence is actually good.
I was debating somebody on social media about climate change, and I said, the last time I checked the Bible, God controls the weather. And I meant it as a joke. And he got furious because you're not supposed to see this climate change stuff as a religion. So there's some people who believe that an all-present being, God, has control over natural disasters and that humans have no control over natural disasters. If you believe in the Bible, if you're Christian, this is where it comes. So what about different religions? Islamic people, I wonder what they believe in climate change when they think that Allah is over everything. So not everybody, it just seems like it because the elites in these capitals throughout Europe and throughout Asia, and they get together in these conferences and they talk about climate change, but we don't talk about the person, the ordinary person who may be really religious and does not accept that man is responsible for natural disasters.
And even if you say fossil fuels are the cause of this 1 degree increase centigrade in temperatures, the benefits could outweigh that 1 degree increase centigrade in the climate. Our ability to master or our ability to adapt to that warming is paradoxically fueled by fossil fuels. And so the idea that we should eliminate fossil fuels, even if the benefits of fossil fuels outweigh the negatives, is just preposterous to me.
And they're so abundant. If you look at fossil fuels and proved reserves around the world, there's new discoveries all the time in different locations around the globe. And to say that we're going to run out or leave it in the ground when we have the overall abundancy of fossil fuels that could last many, many decades. Coal is so abundant. So is natural gas and oil. Russia has huge shale deposits. Now, Vladimir Putin has already said he's not going to frack, but fracking is always an option. But the environmentalists say leave it in the ground. Leave it in the ground does not make any sense, and it doesn't make economic sense either.
Why do you think the left is so catastrophizing everything? Like everything is a catastrophe, climate catastrophe, COVID catastrophe, whatever, other catastrophe. Like everything is a catastrophe to them. Like where does that come from? Like why do you think they do that?
I think it started with Al Gore and the inconvenient truth. Al Gore has been banging the drum about climate change for a long time. I think it is a way to win elections and get people scared. It's amazing how young people, people who believe in climate change, have to see a psychiatrist because they're so worried. And this starts in schools. So they're getting brainwashed from students by teachers as early as kindergarten through 6, and then in high school, and then in college. So that's something too, but it makes for good campaign rhetoric. One thing I always ask the left is, what is climate change and how do you define it? Because they change it all the time. Is it the temperature change? Is it sea level rising? Is it the effect on natural resources? What do we mean by climate change? Is it pollution? Is it a clean environment? Is it conservation? I would say that I conserve more energy than most people do. For our entire marriage, and I've been married 15 years, I have air dried my clothes. I never use a dryer on my clothes.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then I try to walk.
I
like it. I just think it makes a better, it saves energy.
It makes it a little bit less dry. The clothes is a little bit less. I agree with
and
that.
It doesn't wear out your clothes. And I wear a lot of man-made fibers. And so those dry very quickly in the air. So no reason to dry. We have recycled our entire marriage. So we do that. I've lived in places where recycling has always been. Yeah. So is it conservation? Should we focus on conservation instead of being afraid of all this climate change?
I think in their view, and that's what Alex Epstein talks about in Fossil Future, right? It's not so much like conservation or pollution. It's basically any impact on the planet is bad.
Yeah,
by humans, right?
And that hurts economic development and job growth.
Coming back to catastrophes, right? The left always has these, climate catastrophe, racism catastrophe, COVID catastrophe, sexism catastrophe, and war on women. Like everything is a war or catastrophe or existential crisis. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are two main purposes. Fear allows you to control the population easier.
Yep.
And 2, by doing so, it allows you to grab power. Right, and say, hey, we know there's this crisis, so the government has to act. Winning elections is upstream from that. I think the main agenda, give us more power because there's this crisis. The government has to act. I think those are the two main reasons.
And there's dissemination by the media. So you look at the elite media that are in cities that are not really affected by climate change or do not produce energy. So New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles used to have some oil drilling. California's got rid of it. But if you took the elites to different states where they produce oil and gas and to a certain extent solar and wind, you would get a different portrayal of energy, and especially in oil and gas, if you were allowed to report from the states that have the big production. And that goes with countries too, like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and others. So that is something, dissemination of information from Democrats' allies in the media. The elites are in areas where there is no production of energy. If they were in other areas, they would get to see how many jobs are created, how industrious, how technological, sophisticated energy extraction is in the United States.
That's also why they don't care about gas prices, right? Because they don't drive, right? Like if you live in LA, you can take, you can walk from Manhattan, to the grocery store, 2 blocks, But if you live in Oklahoma and you have to drive, I drove through Kansas, right? I couldn't find a grocery store. There's grocery stores only every 30, 40 miles. Imagine living in the middle of Kansas and you have to drive 40 miles to go to the grocery store. You can't do that unless you have a car, obviously.
Right. You have electricity generation, you have mobility, and you have industrial heat that all needs to be transitioned to electricity if you're an adherent of climate change and the new Green Deal. But what about the people who have cars and they do not have access to electricity? They live in an apartment. I don't have a garage myself. We live in a townhome without a garage. So how are you going to power or plug in an electric vehicle? That eliminates a lot of poor people
Yeah, just don't drive.
Yeah, what are you supposed to do? And then in the plug-in, you have to wait 40 minutes now. Now, chargers and batteries are going to improve in technology over the years, but there's going to be a whole class of people that are not going to be able to buy electric vehicles because of where they live. It hurts the poor. It's not realistic or cost effective for everybody to drive electric vehicles.
Correct. So I just want to circle back. There's a phrase, circle back. I want to circle back a little bit to this idea of the left being anti-human. And the way you know that is, so they used to be pro-nuclear until nuclear became possible, until nuclear became something that could power a lot of the country. Even with solar and wind, as soon as solar and wind becomes something that can high proportion of our energy supply, then they claim, okay, well, it's hard to transport it or it's hard to build it. As soon as an energy source gets to a level where it can actually be a substantial percentage of our energy supply, they all of a sudden switch and become anti that energy source. And so that's how you know that it's not so much that they care about pollution or resource depletion. It's all about being anti-human and minimizing the productivity of humans and having less humans and have no human impact on the planet.
It's too bad this stuff breaks down by party. I think we should all be concerned, in other words, but it breaks down by party. The Republicans say drill, baby, drill, and the Democrats say leave it in the ground. And so you have this, difficulty of trying to figure out an energy policy for the whole
but I think
country.
a lot of it is more, it's like group think. Okay, I'm a Republican, so I have to think a certain way. I'm a Democrat, I have to think a certain way. So it's not so much a rational decisions that people make. It's more, it comes from group think, a lack of courage, lack of will to say something different from what, your peers are saying.
And you have this Green New Deal. People believe change has to come from the federal government. Why can't it come from states and localities?
Free market, right?
Right. Let the free market, let it bubble up from the free market. But I'm a big adherent of states' rights. So let the states choose to subsidize their green energy policies if they want to, if California wants to do that.
Because it's not about making the country better. It's about giving them more power, right?
Right. We have to centralize it from the federal government. And that's the scary thing. But going back to, let's talk about the cost thing, because adherents to the Green New Deal folks, they're always like, don't think about cost because the world is going to end by 2030.
Oh, will it? Are you saying we only have like 8 years left?
Yeah.
But I better make the most of it, man.
Yeah. Do what you can right where you're alive. But it has to be affordable. So let's look at alternatives and how much do they cost relative to what people can afford to pay? That's the thing. It's affordability. And then can it be produced on demand and reliability? We talked about reliability as a problem. How many different types of machines can it power?
Yep.
We've already talked about ships. We've already talked about semi-trucks. They're not able to be powered by fossil fuel or alternatives. So there's versatility. And there's scalability. How many people can it serve? Talked about that. People who live in apartments are probably not going to be able to buy electric vehicles. So scalability. So solar and wind do not have all of these attributes. It's too expensive. It's not reliable. It's intermittent. And it cannot completely power mobility, not to mention industrial heat for plastics and cement and products that you need industrial. Because we're talking about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for industrial heat to produce steel from a coking process with coal. You still need coal to make steel.
Right. I really like Epstein's book, Fossil Future, because he's a philosopher. I really love how he breaks it down. When it comes to energy policy, what is your philosophy? What is your moral goal? Are you pro-human or are you anti-human? Whether you choose one moral goal or the other, the energy policy flows directly from that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. He has some really good ideas about dissemination and about how there's a knowledge system that is propagated by education and the media, and that is hard to argue an alternative point of view. And that's what he wanted to do in this book. And it was effective. I think he talks about people who come up to him and say, hey, I'm I'm willing to listen to you. Or teachers that come up to him and say, I'm trying to get both sides of the story. And imagine that, a teacher's teaching both sides of the story. So to ask students about, well, what are the pros of fossil fuels? What are the cons of fossil fuels?
Yeah, he calls it primary moral goal. So the left's primary moral goal is anti-human, whereas in his book, he argues that our primary moral goal should be pro-human. Let me read you this quote. The issue of one's primary moral goal is a crucial one in philosophy that we are almost never taught to think about. Yet, it shapes our evaluations to an almost unimaginable degree. In other words, if your primary moral goal is humans are negatively impacting the planet, then your policy should be, let's have less human impact. Let's have less humans. On the other hand, if your primary moral goal is pro-human, then you think, okay, how do we make life easier for humans? How do we have more humans? Philosophy drives everything. The energy policy, drill baby drill, or, let's get rid of fossil fuels, is directly downstream from that primary moral goal.
They're almost losing the moral argument because they say leave it in the ground. Well, leave it in the ground is kind of saying that you admit that there's plenty of fossil fuels to go around if you say leave it in the ground. So that argument is spurious.
Correct.
But fossil fuels are affordable for the most part. So you have oil, natural gas, and gasoline. Now, those are high right now, but it goes in cycles. But usually they're affordable. Then solar panels, wind turbines, and long-distance power lines all add to the cost. And in these countries where fossil fuels are used so much, like China, like India, the most populated places on Earth, are using 85% fossil fuels, all kinds of coal. And coal in China generates 3 times as much energy as Texas uses in a year. Power plants are coming online all the time in China, even though China says they're part of the framework to eliminate climate change. Also, life expectancy. So one thing Alex Epstein does in the book, and these are correlations, they're not causations, but he looks at energy use and GDP per capita are correlated. He looks at life expectancy correlated, population correlated. He may make some spurious conclusions about the causation of fossil fuels in terms of GDP per capita and energy use. But, that's a factor too. But how about the billions of people who do not have electricity, and how do you power that? 2.4 billion people use wood and animal waste to cook and heat their homes. So they're not empowered with electricity. 1.5 billion people in the world are partially empowered, and 10% of the world has no electricity at all.
Right. If you have a pro-human perspective, you would be concerned about them. But if you have an anti-human primary moral goal, then you're like, well, it's better than impacting the planet.
And climate change adherents always talk about natural disasters. Every time there's incidents of, I talked about wildfires and forest fires and floods and all these existential climate-related deaths. Well, climate-related deaths have actually gone way down over the years.
Right. And Brent, I don't know about you, but I'm just tired of living in a world where everything is a catastrophe. It's so draining. Like every time I hear, Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or some of these other Democrats, they're like, it's a crisis. It's a crisis. Stop what you're doing. Stop living. Stop having your computer. Stop drinking coffee. Stop driving cars. Stop flying airplanes. Do you want to live like that? I don't.
I don't either. I mean, I despise all of this fear mongering, and
exactly.
It goes in cycles, and it's in political cycles.
Same thing with COVID. Like, wear a mask, get your booster, or you're gonna die. It's like, dude, just let people live. Let people the hell alone. I'm tired. The government loses credibility by making everything a crisis. Pick and choose what's a crisis and what's not. Like 9/11 is a crisis, right? It's a true crisis. Saying that we're going to die in 15 years, right? Like, stop living. I'm just tired of hearing it all the time.
Journalists do this.
Yeah.
They love hyperbole. They can always find some expert that will talk about the end of the world and then put that on the front page. We talked about global cooling already in the 1970s.
Well, it seems like a lot of experts, so-called designated experts, are those people who talk about doom a lot, right? Like Paul Ehrlich, all of these COVID experts that say this is the worst thing since the plague.
Yeah.
It seems like it pays to be a doom spreader.
Fear provides much tinder to the fire of books.
Fear sells,
right?
What I mean. Sells magazines, sells books, but also gives government power. That's why fear and existential threats and catastrophes, that generates clicks, that sells newspapers. Governments, bureaucrats love it because it gives them a reason to consolidate power. If you just say, hey, everything's good. Enjoy your life. That's not something that some power-hungry bureaucrat can use to consolidate more power.
Fear leads to behavior that just is really strange.
Population control.
So you have people who will not drink dairy products or eat dairy products because they believe that cows produce methane, releasing methane into the atmosphere from the gastric processes of a cow, or don't want to eat meat, so they want plant-based products. Hey, I'm all for freedom of choice. It's a free country. But people doing this for environmental reasons, I'm not going to drink milk because I'm worried about the environment. It doesn't really make sense.
Dude, I don't want to live in like a stone age again. I want to live comfortably. I want to have electricity. I want to have good food. I want to fly around the world. I want to drive a car anywhere I want to. I want to have complete freedom. I'm really, really tired of these power-hungry people who are always trying to make me feel guilty for the way that I live.
Some of this is ridiculous, too. We talked about the World Economic Forum a lot on this podcast. We had an whole episode on it. There are actually articles on their website with scientists who say you should eat insects because insects are low carbon emitters. Can you imagine that? I mean, this is the way people think. No dairy, no meat, get your protein from insects. So we're going backward in terms of human impact and the growth of humanity and flourishing of humanity. We're going backward. We're going to eat insects. We're not going to eat dairy products. We're not going to eat meat. How are we going to survive?
Just to go back about human flourishing, I lived in the Soviet Union. I know what it's like not to have a restroom in your house. My grandma lived in this house that was built, I don't know, maybe 1905 or like really old house. And there's like an apartment, think about like an apartment complex, right? With like maybe 10 apartments. And then there's like this little hut with the restroom that everybody uses in that apartment complex. I know what it's like not to have modern accommodations. And so this idea that we should go back to that, no thanks. I've lived through it.
Go
Been
backwards.
there, done that.
And fossil fuels create sanitation. That's how we have our modern sanitation, because we have machines that are provided by fossil fuels. Are you going to run a water sanitation plant through solar? Well, what if solar fails and the batteries fail? How are you going to clean water? How are you going to be able to flush the toilet? So it's amazing, and if you look at what the free market has done, and a lot of regulations and administrative rulings on air emissions in the United States have gone way down since 1970. We used to have acid rain and smog. That has gone down. Ammonia
has gone down.
Yeah, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, all of this has gone down since 1970 in the United States. We're lower carbon emitters in the United States based on what the free market
And I believe
has
in
done.
clean water. I believe in safe and clean energy. I don't want to live in a smog-filled city, but I also want to be comfortable. I want to have a toilet that I can flush. Like I want to have a car. I want to have the ability to fly. I want to live life like an American.
How about the developing world, on the other hand? These are people who are getting by on less than $2 a day. But if you want to create food security, which is what the left always talks about, we have food insecurity. We don't have human security because there's not enough food. Well, fossil fuels allow more crops to be harvested. You have fertilizer. You have pesticide and herbicide.
Machines.
You have irrigation, machines for irrigation. You have transportation. You have water purification. All this done by fossil fuel machines. And then the food, therefore, becomes plentiful and cheap. Then you have air travel. You have seafaring shipping for world trade. So you can get that, get the grain to market. So what we've had recently with the war in Ukraine was a problem with Russia on the Black Sea creating pretty much a blockade. And then that's where the breadbasket of Europe is in Ukraine. So they're allowing exports of grain and wheat coming from Ukraine, and the Russians are letting it pass. But can you imagine, what if we had a ban on fossil fuels and ships were not able to transport food? I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to put solar panels on cargo ships? You're going to run cargo ships with batteries? That's not going to happen. So a complete transition to away from fossil fuels will hurt the people trying to eat.
Another concern is the geopolitical concern, right? What if we decarbonize, but then China continues to use fossil fuels, right? Wouldn't that put America at a disadvantage? What are the geopolitical implications of the left's war on energy?
And it's easy to get all these countries on board, with these mandates for climate change. It sounds great, but in reality, it's very expensive. Germany has gone all in on wind and solar, and they pay some of the highest power prices, electricity prices in Europe. And now Vladimir Putin is going to decrease gas availability to Europe. And then now you're having Germany and France, they're turning off the lights at night on their buildings.
Right.
So you have these cities that are going back, they're turning back the clock. I mean, imagine that. We have electricity. Now we're not going to have electricity because of this transition. Too quick and unsmart, unintelligent transition to
and they say something
away
like,
from fossil fuel.
they say something like you can only use air conditioning in certain times of the day.
Oh, yeah. It's just ridiculous. But going back to the developing world, shelter, too, homes. Fossil fuel machines provide for excavating, grading, lifting, cutting, paving, all that's powered by fossil fuels to build humanity's shelter, cooling and heating homes. Even if it's a fan is better than what a lot of people in the developing world have right now. Hospitals need a dependable source, an abundant source for electrical power because of all the machines that you have. 50% of the costs are on power in hospitals. You have MRI machines, fetal monitors, refrigeration, anesthetics. All of that needs a reliable source of power or people are going to die.
Had we followed the left's policy prescriptions back in the 70s and the 80s, we wouldn't even have the computer and internet revolutions because all of those machines are powered by fossil fuels.
Yeah. I mean, you would have, we talk about society going backwards and mining. Let's talk about the mining of rare earths and typical elements that you need for solar panels and the magnets used in wind turbines. That has to be mined. So these rare earths and other types of minerals are being extracted by machines that are fossil fuel powered. And you're probably not going to be able to transition away from that. So.
And let's talk about our knowledge system. So the media only quotes these designated experts who are really just climate change catastrophiers. Mm-hmm. And so the country doesn't really hear the opposite side of the argument because the media only promotes the people who talk catastrophe as it relates to the climate. The climate change, even within academia and within the research community, the climate scientists, they operate like a cartel. I actually have personal experience with that because
when you're in grad school,
when I was in grad school, my PhD advisor was Edward Wegman. He testified in 2006 for the Republicans. He testified against Michael Mann's hockey stick. He proved that Michael Mann's hockey stick, the paper that published the hockey stick, he incorrectly applied the statistical methodology known as principal components analysis.
Okay.
And he showed that the hockey stick isn't really a hockey stick when you apply the statistical methodology correctly. And you should have seen what happened to him. The left, all of this climate change cartel, they came after him. They started filing plagiarism reports. They started calling his administrators, like his department chair, the university administrator. So they started filing all these false reports against him. And so that's how this climate change cartel operates, is that as soon as you speak out against them, they will come after you. And
cancel you.
They'll try to cancel you. Absolutely.
And you were completely innocent because you were a grad student that needed a committee chair for your dissertation.
Correct.
And you found out that your committee chair was being canceled.
Correct.
So then you weren't able to put a committee together. And not to get too academic here, but you need a group of PhDs so you can do your dissertation so they can sign off and approve your dissertation.
And mind you, he gave that testimony like 7 years before I joined his lab.
But he was still tainted.
Exactly. Ever since then, for like the last 10 years, they've been coming after him. Like all these left-wing blogs started making these false claims about how he's funded by the Koch brothers and he's like an energy
denier, climate
denier, and the energy industry shill.
Oh, yeah.
All of which are false. By the way, he's a Democrat, but he's an honest Democrat. He told the truth.
I've had debates on fossil fuels and climate change, and it's difficult to have a honest conversation with people who are so involved with this religion of climate change. It's just tough to argue with them.
My thing is, if you are people in good faith, if you really believe that the climate change is this existential threat, then you should have debates with people. You should try to convince them. If the science is as you claim it is, right? It's settled. 97% of scientists agree with you, which is also nonsense. So you should have no fear. But the truth is, it's all political. The science is not on their side.
I've been accused during my debates on climate change online of being backed by oil and gas companies. Like I'm taking money from the oil industry to have this argument. And people have said, I can't believe it. You're not funded by the oil and gas industry, but you're arguing against climate change. And I say, yeah, I'm not funded by the oil and gas industry.
Just like everything that the left says, it's actually a projection. They're taking money from left-wing donors, left-wing climate change nonprofits. They're taking money from these renewable energy companies. So they are actually the ones that are bought off by all of these special interests, not the people that they claim are.
Yeah, I mean, it's very frustrating to have any kind of argument against this dogma that you have to deal with. But going back to the way we need energy to act for a flourishing society around the world, you have to have some type of control factor over energy. It needs to be controllable. Fossil fuels are controllable, and sunlight and wind are not controllable. They're free.
Yep.
And they're renewable, but they're not controllable. We have to store energy somehow, and energy needs to be dense like oil is in the first place. And it needs to be abundant like fossil fuels are, so we have enough for our lifetime. And also energy needs to be mobile. It has to be transformed and sent somewhere. We talked about Germany and France. They're turning back the clock on the way energy reacts. And so very frustrating.
Just to go back to this climate change cartel going after academics or anybody who speaks out against them. I mean, that's the whole idea of going after people. They want to taint that person. So what they want to do is they want to try to discredit that person and say, hey, don't listen to him. He's funded by the oil companies. He's funded by Coke. He's a plagiarist, which is false. He is so and so and so. That's the left's playbook. Anybody, not just in climate, but anybody who they perceive as a threat to their narrative, to their worldview, they want to taint that person. A completely unrelated example would be just look at the way they went after Clarence Thomas, because he's an African American who doesn't buy into their narrative. So this whole Anita Hill thing, right? They wanted to discredit him because they wanted to say to their supporters, look, he's not a real black man. Don't listen to him. He's a sexual predator. He's a right-wing kook. He's not one of you. And same thing with Brett Kavanaugh. It's not so much that they knew that they could prevent him from being on the Supreme Court. It's to taint him so that whatever rulings he issues as a Supreme Court justice, the left could just dismiss him. Oh, he's just a sexual predator. Don't listen to him. So that's what the left does, is that they want to taint or discredit anybody with a big voice who is against their agenda. So that's a classic playbook of the left. Filing complaints, making up stories, accusations, all of this. It's a way to taint your political opponents so that that person is tainted in the face of the public, and they can try to dismiss him as like, he's just a sexual predator. He's not a good guy. So obviously what he's saying is false.
This is coming from the elites in our capitals around the country and also in Europe and Asia. They get together, they go to these conferences, they talk, it's groupthink. They talk amongst themselves and they believe these things because they don't have any type of intellectual diversity and different ideas. And so then the elites turn around, they go back to their countries and they do these rules and administrative rulings. For example, in the Netherlands, they're saying that in the Netherlands, to talk about agriculture, one of the breadbaskets of Europe too, they create a lot of food wealth for the continent. And so the elites said, oh no, your pesticides and your fertilizers have negative impacts on the environment. Again, human impact is bad. And that you are going to have to get rid of some of your cattle for dairy, because dairy produces environmental problems, methane from cows, and then the ammonia from nitrogen and fertilizer are going to hurt the environment. And so now you're seeing people rising up. You're seeing the farmers say, hey, you're not going to trample our livelihood because you're going to take away our fertilizer, you're going to take away our cattle. So now you have tractors that are going to elites' houses, they're burning dung, and they're putting hay bales in front of roads. And at least you're seeing people who are rising up against this. But it's coming from the elites. They go to these conferences, they do these negotiations, they listen to people like Bill Gates and Al Gore, and then they go back to their home countries and they try to mandate this stuff from centrally planned economies in the capital. And it hurts civilization.
Well, because their premise isn't to help the population. Their goal, primary moral goal is to accumulate power. and wealth. And so they're not operating in good faith. They're just there for their own selfish reasons.
And you have the educational system too that indoctrinates people on the way energy is used and climate change and, scaring people from the time that they're in kindergarten. You have these projects in schools and so it's very difficult to have an alternative view, especially if you're a parent and your kids are going to public school, you're probably going to deal with some teachers that are going to indoctrinate them against fossil fuels.
Absolutely. I just want to emphasize another point. When the left says, listen to the scientists, my refrain to that, no, I don't listen to the scientists. I consider the scientists. In order to have an effective policy, you don't just consider the science. You consider the economic implications, human implications, political implications. There's a reason why we elect policymakers and not scientists. Policymakers has to consider all of these competing factors, not just what the science says. And so this idea that we should listen to the scientists, no, we should consider what the scientists say and take that into consideration, but we don't just blindly listen to the scientists.
We're getting past our hour, and that's the time that we want to wrap this up. But we should look at fossil fuels as a way to advance humanity and flourishing, not negative impacts, but positive impacts of fossil fuels. So evaluate fossil fuels on their positive impacts, lifting people out of poverty, economic development, job creation, better industrial growth, supplying machines in hospitals to keep people alive, supplying power to agriculture to produce food, getting better GDP per capita, world population growth instead of not growing the population, better productivity, better technology, better ideas. All of these come from fossil fuels.
So our primary moral goal should be to advance human flourishing. We are pro-human. We are not anti-human.
So we're looking at everything in energy wrong. Look at energy in a positive way and look at a smart transition. We believe in all the above, but a smarter transition instead of a abrupt and catastrophic blind transition that the Green New Deal is.
A careful, methodical transition.
Safer world provided by fossil fuels. We've got cost-effective machines through abundance of fossil fuels. It nourishes billions of people for abundant food and clean water.
We are for change, but we're for smart change.
Yeah. Well, I hope you've seen something or heard something in this podcast that you like. Check out the literature. Look at alternative views. Think about fossil fuels in a way that's different than other people. And be all of the above. Be interested in wind and solar and batteries and technology and how technology grows. There will be an electrification in the United States. There will be a transition to electric vehicles. It's just not going to work for everybody. And again, for mobility, think about airplanes, think about cargo ships. We wouldn't have any type of economy. We'll have an economy of Venezuela if we transition away from fossil fuels for jet fuel and for diesel fuel for ships.
Let's preserve American economic might and our military might.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for listening. Next week, we will talk about Tucker Carlson and we'll touch base on some of the important concepts that he talks about on his show and also in his book. I think it will be a very entertaining and informative episode.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Truth Caviar Show. Email us at truthcaviarshow@gmail.com and let us know what you think about the show. And remember, no bias, no bull, no fear, just hard truths.